Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Philip Bowring. I am here in this chair not because I have any particular official role at the club, but because I have known Ian here for a very long time as a friend and as a journalist. And I'm here above all because I think this is a very good book. This is a book which tells us a lot about the social history of the Europeans and the Eurasians and the Chinese in the first 4 decades of this century in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and elsewhere. It tells us a lot of fascinating detail about life in the internment camps in Stanley and elsewhere during the Japanese occupation. And above all, it is the history of a very remarkable woman, a very small, very strong, and a very resourceful woman who was Ian's mother. So, Ian, please talk about Billie.
Thank you. Well, thank you, FCC, and thanks to my partners, Jean, my wife, and my publisher, Pete Spurrier. And I'm going to talk today about 4 main characters in my book. And the first one is Mary Ann Warner. She was a Victorian lady. She was born in 1835 in a very small village called Malvern Link. And her father was a farm manager. He didn't own the farm. He managed it and mainly to provide pheasants for the local squires. He was a very ruthless farmer and managed his farm on a very, very tight rein. And he also was quite traditional. He had 5 daughters, but he wanted the 5 daughters to marry older women who were affluent, not of their choice. This was very common in those days. Well, Mary Ann didn't want any of that, and she left home. And in my opinion, considering her subsequent career, I believe she worked, Malvern was a famous spa town where the society ladies came down to take the waters. And I believe Mary Ann worked in one of these spa hotels because that's where she learned the business she would develop later. And she lived in this farmhouse, still there, and it's only changed hands a couple of times, and the people who run it now are still conservationists. And that banister you see is the same one Mary Ann would hold on her way to the bedroom. We went to Malvern, and this is the church where she got married eventually, and there's a graveyard which contains a riddle that led to a bit of a scandal, but that's in the book. So Mary Ann ends up in Southampton, and she runs this, she joins this dock hotel, which is right next to the peninsula, the P&O offices. They had moved down once the railway line was established between Southampton and London. And so people would come straight off the dock. Sometimes they'd stay in the hotel, or they'd go to the pub around the back, in the back street. So Mary Ann very quickly heard all these stories from the seamen and their adventures in Bombay, Calcutta, Penang, Singapore, and of course Hong Kong. And I believe that's where she hatched her plan. Now, she did marry a P&O officer, a P&O engineer to be precise. Unfortunately, he died, so she, and leaving her with a child, so she was in a fix. But a previous person who had courted her was this chap, Ted Newman on the left, and he was a P&O steward. And he came from Bloomsbury, there are his parents, and he came from the wrong side of Bloomsbury, the lower part, which was right next door to the biggest slum in central London called the Rookery, which Hogarth depicts quite vividly as Gin Lane and places like that. So he also got out of London. You know, he wanted to escape his circumstances. So as soon as Mary Ann's husband died, she got a proposal from Ted Newman from Hong Kong. And she didn't take long. She decided to take up the offer. And this is the waterfront that she met in Hong Kong, and the P&O office where Ted worked. And she was quick to tell him, you know, I'm not just going to, I'll give you children, but, you know, I've got a plan, you know. I'm wearing the pants around here. And they got married in St. John's Church, and they stayed in the P&O buildings. They rented opposite in Old Bailey Street, just opposite the Gill. It's all still there now. And so you just walk down the street, probably past this road, on the way to his work on the Prior, and then he was on the way back, he would stop off at the Freemasons Club, which is on the left. I'm pretty sure Mary Ann was a worker, and she would have joined maybe the Hong Kong Hotel, because they would have absolutely valued somebody like her, because most of the women who came out were, you know, hoity-toity wives of officials, but she was a, you know, sleeves rolled up kind of woman. Now, in those days, the Hong Kong Hotel, the club was a Freemasons club, so it was actually open to all classes and races. It was very democratic like that. And of course, the P&O office, which ran a ferry service up and down the China coast. All these places were the internet of today, tremendous sources of information. And in 1873, they got some news, and they packed their bags. They had 2 small children by then, and they left, lock, stock, and barrel, for Sheifu in northern China. And you know, in those days, most people who went to China were missionaries, merchants, consular officers, and they had organizations behind them. If they got into trouble, they could come, you know, they'd come back. But these guys, you know, went up with their kids, just the 2 of them. So this is the hotel which they came across. And they soon, to my horror, when I got there, I found it was 1 mile from the settlement. I mean, who runs a hotel 1 mile from town? And it was a long mile, too. We discovered that Mary Ann's market was not the passing trade, not the sailors coming off the warships. It was the women of Shanghai who wanted to escape the summer heat, and I suspect their husbands. And they would come up with their kids, and Mary Ann by now knew exactly what women wanted. She had wine, she had spacious rooms, there was a lovely safe beach in front of the hotel, and they never lost money. This is just a family shot of the Newmans. There's Frank Newman on the left, he's our next character, and his sister's on the right. Now, Frank is our second character. So he grows up in Sheifu. He was born in Hong Kong, but taken up to Sheifu as an infant. So he was raised by his ama and the Chinese hotel staff. So he probably spoke Chinese before he spoke English. And he grew up not only fluent in Chinese, but he liked them, he understood them, he respected them. And I think he joined the customs when he was 19. Look at the biceps on him. He's the guy on the far left. Nothing much to do growing up except row and swim and ride horses. And I think they got him in the customs because a few months later they had the Sheifu Regatta, and the customs crew won everything, pretty much. And then he also went on to win individual races. So he catches the eye of Robert Hart, who lives in Sheifu, has his second home in Sheifu. And Robert Hart used to recruit people from the minor public schools in England, and they used to come out, and they came out with a superior air. And he soon realized that Frank Newman was quite different. Number one, he spoke the language better than he did. He spoke like a Chinese. Now, he got on well with them, didn't look down upon them, and he had an equable temperament. So he promoted him, and in the late 1890s, he sent him to Chongqing, first of all in the customs, but at the end of the year of 1898, he became postmaster 26 in Chongqing. And this were the days when it was inaccessible by steamer. You had to go up by junk, a journey that took weeks. And as you can see, they had teams of Chinese laborers pulling the junks over the rapids. Only in 1898 did the first steamer arrive, and I'm pretty sure Frank was there. Now, Frank becomes an excellent postal worker. It's very hard to retain postal officers because a lot of them in these remote places took to the booze, went mad. It just became excessively lonely. But because Frank fitted in wherever he went, he was able to adapt well. But he had one major flaw in the eyes of his bosses. You weren't supposed to marry Chinese or Eurasians, etc. So Frank, what does he do? He gets to Chengdu. First thing he does, he marries Mei Lan in the middle there, who's the daughter of a Chinese merchant. Big strike against him. He's not, he can't bring her to the clubs. He's broken the rules, risking his career. Then he has a Eurasian daughter, Jessie, the bottom right. Not very white. He's broken the rules again. And then he goes he's posted to Xi'an, and in the evenings he hears the shout of a girl screaming next door. And this girl belongs to a trader on the Silk Road. And, he's beating her. So he can't stand it after a few weeks, and he goes over, a transaction takes place, he brings back Dolly. Dolly is the one on the right, of indeterminate race and age, but he puts her name down in his travel document, which served as a passport, and strike 3 against him. Finally, he gets a good promotion. He's the acting postmaster of Changsha. And this is around 1915. He arrives in Changsha. And Hart has told somebody that Changsha is the center for anti-foreigner sentiment. So, but he knows that Frank's the man to put there. And then he's still traveling around the province a lot. And he knows that he leaves his wife, who's not allowed to go to the club, alone a lot. And she's often quite lonely. And one day, and I heard this from my Auntie Dolly, one day, a Chinese man in a gown is brought across from the main city to the island in a sampan, and he's carrying a basket. He's carrying a basket very gingerly, and the family come out to greet him, and they open the blankets very carefully, and inside is this tiny, tiny Chinese baby. And Mama steps forward, clasps the baby to her bosom. She worshipped the ground I trod on, said my mother. I mean, it was a complete and utter love affair. And that's how my mother started life in Changsha. And a few weeks later, Yuan dies, the Republican president, and the Civil War takes place. And there's bitter fighting between northern troops and southern troops, and Changsha's in the middle. I mean, Newman writes to his boss, God, the soldiers are surrounding the post office. They're trying to get in and get some money. We've barricaded the front and the back. You know, it's pretty scary stuff. Anyway, so Frank decides that while he will stay on in Changsha, he will move his family to Shanghai. And he does something quite extraordinary. This is an age where Chinese girls stay at home until they're married. But he sends all his daughters to top English schools in Shanghai. And my mother goes to the Shanghai Public School for Girls, which is an extraordinary school. It was actually run by the municipal council, and they recruited these single British women from England. They came over first class on the P&O, and these were independent, critically minded, rather adventurous women. I mean, fantastic role models. And the kids who went there were from all nationalities. German, Polish, you name it. Even Chinese, if you had an English-sounding name. And so my mother, you know, she learned the British curriculum, played netball and hockey, took part in Gill and Sullivan operettas, and came out pretty much, you know, thinking like an English person, and fluent in English, of course. So all these women came out confident, with great English skills, able to compete in a man's world. Now, Frank, as I said, he traveled a lot, and he got a bit lonely on his travels, and he did, in fact, have a relationship with a young Russian lady. It's not the one on the left. The one on the left is actually a school friend of my mother's who became a taxi dancer. But Frank likely met her in Shanghai, and she got pregnant, and the evidence suggests that he never intended to leave his Chinese family. In those days, men, whether they were European or whether they were Chinese, they added, you know, mistress one, mistress two, but you kept the core family. But he got into a little trouble because the Russian lady, they were all stateless. And, you know, they had to resort to all kinds of menial jobs in Shanghai. What they wanted above all was a passport. She kept nagging Frank. Anyway, Frank actually got quite a good idea. He went to the consulate in Shanghai to renew his passport. And he said, instead of putting his Chinese wife's name, he put the Russian wife's name, wife and daughter. So they got passports. It's quite clever, really. Then he got on a ship and they went on a tour. But he did get caught. And I found a court case where magistrate is scolding Newman, falsification of documents, you know. So poor Newman, everybody knows about this. So he leaves Shanghai, but he goes up to Qingdao, and he continues to pay my mother's school bills until a year before she's due to graduate. And he dies in 1937, and the British consul in Qingdao sends a letter to my mother saying, you know, here's the death certificate, sad to report. And a week later, another message comes from Qingdao, and they say, we found this letter in your father's pocket. And the letter says, I've been wanting to come home for some time, but circumstances have not made it possible. So he did want to keep both families, but he couldn't. But it was a great solace to his wife, and of course, his daughter. My mother and I went back to Shanghai in 1993. We visited her old schools, and this is her with the headmistress. So Billie, at 16, goes out to the workforce, and she joins Reuters. There are journalists here among them, right? Well, some of us are journalists. Anyway, she joins Reuters, and she's taught how to edit by Spencer Musa. Spencer Musa came down to Hong Kong and was a very famous journalist before the war. Nobody remembers him? All right, okay. And then, of course, the pay is very low, but she learns the skill. By now, she's supporting her mother. And then she sees an ad in the newspaper, and there's a new publication being launched, and they're looking for a girl Friday. And she goes for the interview, and she's rather puzzled. It's not in a business district, it's in a residential area, in an apartment, in a block of flats. She goes into the flat, and it's completely bare of furniture, just one chair, one table and 2 chairs. All the other rooms are bare. And there's this guy sitting there, he's Chinese, he's wearing an English 3-piece suit. My name is Wen Wan-ning, and I'm the chief editor of this. Okay, what is this? Well, we haven't started yet. You're going to help furnish the place and start the place. If you pass the test, I'm going to give you a test. And he read her an extract of The Shropshire Lad. Quite a difficult poem, actually. And after she transcribed it, he said, you're the only one out of 50 applicants not to make a single error. So she got the job, and she became office manager, and she looked after the magazine. The magazine was supposed to be a cultural vehicle to bridge the gap between East and West. It was put out in English by Chinese scholars, and Western scholars also contributed to it. And she met... one of the editors was Lin Yutang, of course. Everybody, he became internationally famous with his books. And she also met people like Emily Hahn, the American writer. She got off the boat during a world tour and decided to stay in Shanghai. She went to the office, and she and my mother became instant friends. They were the only 2 women, and my mother knew everything, and Emily needed contacts. And they stayed friends the whole of their lives, with their love lives and war intertwined. And Han didn't care what anybody thought about her, and she did exactly as she liked. And she actually went to live with this well-known Chinese poet, Xin Mei, and this, of course, caused a tremendous scandal in Shanghai. The Japanese War breaks out in 1937, August, and as the Japanese troops come down the coast, some of the expats leave Shanghai, and the foreign correspondents fly in from all over the world. And the mayor of Shanghai calls up Wen, my mother's boss, and says, listen, we need somebody to help me handle these Western correspondents. So, of course, he sends over Billie. And so she's on the podium with the mayor, all the foreign correspondents in front, and a man comes up and whispers in the mayor's ear. And the mayor turns around to my mother and said, oh, Mr. Chang, our regular broadcaster, has taken ill. My mother said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. No, you have a lovely voice. And after we finish here, we want you to go and read the news. My mother's dumbfounded. But sure enough, they put her in a bulletproof coat. They put her in this great big black limousine, which is bulletproof, and they drive to this nondescript area in a nondescript house. They have to change stations all the time because the Japanese are looking for them to shut them down. This is a station representing Free China. something like that, put in front of a desk. You see that red light? Once it comes on, you start reading. Red light comes on. Oh, and just beforehand, the mayor had said, we must call you something. We can't call you, your real name. And there was a well-known actress, not Chinese, called Billie Dove. So he said, we're going to call you Billie Lee, all right? So the red light comes on. Hello, this is Billie Lee from XGOY, Free China radio station. Well, she finishes, I don't know how she gets through it, but she gets through it, and the phone rings, and it's the mayor. Great job, you can keep it. So she does that for several weeks before they're finally forced to flee Shanghai for Hong Kong en masse, the whole staff. So you get to Hong Kong, and it's not just a magazine anymore. They have a new function. You see, the Chinese armies have been driven back, Nanking, right, and the government is now in Chongqing, in the far, far west. All the ports are closed. So Hong Kong, their office becomes also the Chinese government information office. Oh, they didn't really advertise themselves as that. And Wen was actually involved in the publication of rather some anti-Japanese publications. So now they're, first of all, they're the outlet, the voice outlet for the government of Chongqing. Madame Chang comes down and gives broadcasts to appeal to the American public for help. And my mother is there to facilitate that kind of thing. In fact, she later offers her a job, but that's another part of the book. And most importantly, all the foreign correspondents who come to Hong Kong, they have to come to Hong Kong to cover the war. And she helps accredit them. Ernest Hemingway, Edgar Snow, she met all the big names who went out there. And they would be sent from Hong Kong to the front line if they wanted to go to the front line. So in the office, she, there we are. So also, an Australian journalist, W.H. Donald, became very well known, became a very close advisor of the Changs. And of course, he was based mainly in Chongqing, but when he came down to Hong Kong for a break, my mother was assigned to be his secretary, and rather than work in a hotel where he was constantly harassed by media and other people, they worked on a little yacht. And there's Madame Chang on the right. It was Donald who recommended Billie to Madame Chang, and that's why she was later offered a job. So in the office, she's extremely valuable as a resource. She's in this middle ground between East and West where everybody is equal and so forth. But the moment she steps out of the office, she's just a Chinese girl. And, again, off limits to most English bankers and traders. And, but she's on Repulse Bay Beach one weekend, and a man chats her up, and he's Irish, not British. He's got a thing against the British himself. Anyway, he chats her up, falls in love with her, and pursues her for a year. And she finally compromises, and she gets pregnant, and then, at which point his ardor weakens. And he said, oh, God. He said, well, I'll do the decent thing, And they get married in a registry office in early 1940. And then a few weeks later, he meets her, and he says, Billie, my regiment is going home, and don't follow me. Well, of course, by then she was, a few months pregnant. She was devastated. She never understood why. But in the book, we delve into his past and future, and we do find out why he did that. So in early December 1941, she's on the tram going from Happy Valley to work in the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. She hears these distant thuds, and she gets to the office, big crowd outside the bank, and there's Bill O'Neill, Reuters journalist, standing above the crowd. Billie, the balloon's gone up. So there's 3 weeks of battle. The Allies surrender, and then a few weeks later, the civilian population, the British, the Americans, the Dutch, were rounded up. And my mother had a British passport, and she opted to go with the British because she had a child, 18 months old. So they all go into Stanley internment camp, and nearly 3,000 people. This is the bungalow she lived in. It was supposed to accommodate a family, a teacher's family. There were 50 people in there at one time. When she arrived there, a battle had taken place in Stanley. So the walls were smeared with excrement and blood, and the toilets were totally unusable. Thank God the police were, the young strapping police, whom everybody looked down upon, they really, stepped up and they cleaned the place up. And she looked after Brian. As I said, he was 18 months old. In prison camp, she said, there was nowhere to hide. Everybody's character came out. Whether you were high and mighty, your flaws were revealed. Sometimes if you were an ordinary person, you became a hero. And I met a lot of her prisoner of war camp internees, friends. And just a couple of stories. The chap on the far left is Ron Murray, who was 9 years old when he went in, and he had a perfect memory of the camp. And in our bungalow, there was a black marketeer. He actually ran a Hong Kong dairy, so he came in with a lot of money and access to food. And while people were sitting around trying to conserve their energy, this chap would be doing, push-ups on the veranda. Anyway, one night he got wind, the black marketeer, that the Japanese were going to raid his cache. So he quickly got rid of all his stuff. And he went up to Ron's father. Ron was living there with his father and 2 brothers. And he gave them a bunch of eggs. And so the father, he didn't want to be caught with a bunch of eggs either. So he cooked the whole lot. One gigantic omelette. Ron said it was the best meal I've ever had in my life. Didn't last long. It was so rich, they all brought it up. Chap on the right, Morris Two-Gun Cohen. He was from the East End of London, quite a character. He was sent to Canada, where he became a card shark, rather a dodgy real estate developer, and he befriended the oppressed Chinese communities there. And he ended up going on some trade mission to China and talking himself into being a job as bodyguard for Sun Yat-sen. And he had guns on each hip, hence the nickname. One night, my mother felt ill, and one afternoon, and it was diagnosed as acute appendicitis. Not a good place to get it. And anyway, her friends ran round and they got string and can tops to use as makeshift candles for the operation to be conducted. And the operation, they had nurses and doctors there, so it was all, there was a hospital there. It was all quite well done. And when she came to in the hospital, there's Morris, one of the first visitors. And she says, "Kiddo, what do you want?" What do I want? What does it take to get you back on your feet? Morris, we're in a prison camp. Come on, tell me, what do you want? So, Morris, I dream of pineapples. And a few days later, she heard this commotion at the entrance of the ward. And she heard matrons saying, "You can't come in here like that. This is a woman's ward." And there was more shouting. And finally, Morris appears. He's shirtless. He's not a pretty sight, but he's holding a can of pineapples. He had literally bartered the shirt off his back for my mother. So my mother looked after Brian 24 hours a day. Very stressful. Kept her going, but very, very tiring. And they had a system in Stanley whereby the nurses would sometimes relieve mothers of their children for a few hours, give them a break. And 2 nurses came to my mother and said, we're going to take Brian to Tweed Bay. The Japanese had opened up a beach to allow the internees to swim or do what they want. So my mother said, this is wonderful. And she had learned bridge in camp. She was excellent at bridge. She found it easy to memorize 52 cards rather than the number of mahjong tiles you otherwise have to remember. So she went down and she was playing bridge in Bungalow C. And suddenly her friend appears at the door and he's breathless. This is Stephen Balfour. And my mother looks at him and he just says, Billie, come with me. And of course, she's terrified. She said, what is it? Is it Brian? Just come with me. So it's a long walk to Tweed Bay. And Stephen's got big, long strides. My mother's tiny, got small strides, and she's trying to keep up with him. And she's praying as hard as she can. And when she gets to Tweed Bay, there's a long flight of stairs. They go down there, and she sees a group of women, and she sees one of them holding Brian. And at first, of course, she thinks he's asleep. But it turns out he's drowned in a small wading pool that was on the beach. She doesn't really remember much of the weeks that followed. But there was one friend, and this is the 4th character I'm going to introduce, George Giffen. George Giffen was a journalist in camp. He had also come to Hong Kong to reinvent himself. In England, he'd been on the Derbyshire Times during the Depression, and one year they laid off all the seniors to replace them with juniors to save money. And so he was out of a job, went down to London, and was so hard up, he tried to join the army. And the army said, oh, you've got a couple of molars missing. I mean, he said, well, if I get a bridge, will you accept me? And they said, okay. So he went off and he sold his only jacket, and he got a bridge. But then he saw an advertisement in the newspaper. The South China Morning Post was looking for a reporter. So he went along for an interview with Ben Wiley, who was the managing director, and he got his ticket to sail out to Hong Kong, where he did very well. He became assistant editor of the Daily Telegraph, which is the companion paper of the Post. Now, George knew my mother before the war, and he lived in the school block near the bungalow, and he used to pop by and chat with her, and they were friends. And after this terrible tragedy, he just kept coming down and staying with her, just keeping her company. She would cry out Brian's name and faint, and he would catch her. Now, George was a sensitive soul, and he wrote poetry. And a few days after Brian's death, he wrote a poem, and I'll just read you one verse. My dear, no human heart can swell so much as mine, no tongue can tell. The words that are themselves too weak to touch the chords where grief may wreak. Her muted anguish for a loss like yours, such sorrow where recompense implores. The babe that from your womb has gone too young to mortal tomb, bore all the marks of happiness and joy. the promise of a man was in that boy. Well, my mother was very touched, and their friendship deepened. And she told me many years later, you know, when I lost Brian, I lost my mind. I was just going crazy. And all I could think of was to try and replace him. Now, there were big problems. In prison camp, the women had so little food that they lost the ability to menstruate. And then in September 1944, with the Japanese war going against the Japanese, they let in these Red Cross parcels, and quite substantive, 3 per internee. So my mother partook, and the taps came back on. In the final year of the war, everything was at rock bottom. Women were dying of iodine deficiencies, and the doctors were telling people, do not get pregnant. You're going to die. And my mother goes in March 1945, goes to see her doctor, Dr. Smalley, and he examines her, and his face is very grim. Jimmy, he said, Billie, this is very serious. I'm afraid I've got some terrible news. You're pregnant. Whoopee! She smiles. She says, there were no more 2 happier people in camp than George and I. And that relationship sustained them for the rest of their stay in camp. And then in August, they hear on the radio that the Japanese emperor surrendered. Everybody is delighted, but things are about to change for Billie and George. Being a journalist, George was one of the first people out of the camp. He had to go to the South China Morning Post and get control of the paper back from the Japanese. He was helped by Frank Ching, Henry Ching, the editor, who had stayed outside. So they did that, and they intended to meet. I've got the letters and the notes they exchanged, but there was a problem. George had a wife in Canada, just as Billie had a husband who had abandoned her. So the reality of camp became supplanted by the reality of liberation. They never did get together, and she left on an evacuation ship for Manila. Terrible journey. She was seasick all the time, and in Manila, they're not allowed to land, and Dr. Smalley says, listen, you're in bad shape. You're going to need a cesarean. And, we could be months before we get to England. So just then a hospital ship comes in, the New Zealand hospital ship, and they transfer her to that. It's a lot of hustle and bustle. She's lowered down like luggage and waving goodbye to her friends. Anyway, she gets to New Zealand, and she has her cesarean, which is quite a complicated operation in those days. And they take a very, very long time to bring the baby to her. She kept saying, what's wrong? Has he got fingers, and is he missing his toes? What's wrong with him? And finally the doctor brings me out and says, he's small, but bonny. Haven't changed much. I like to end on a happy note, so just a couple more slides. She joins the UN in Shanghai. She works with them in Bangkok. She ends up getting the MBE from the Queen for her services to the UN. Jean and I finally present her with her first grandchildren. Now, what happens to my father? Well, he was prepared. He acknowledged me. He was prepared to take me on, but she said, no, I'm keeping him. And 40 years later, I found him on a remote island in Canada. And He was very accepting. I'd phoned him up beforehand, obviously. His wife was accepting. His daughters, they looked at me, they said, "Oh my God, you look like him, you talk like him, you move like him, and you're a bloody journalist like him." So anyway, I knew him for over 20 years before he died. And when he died, I rang up Kevin Sinclair, the legendary Kevin Sinclair of the South China Morning Post. I said, "Kevin," he was doing a story on him. I said, "You know, he's my dad. Oh, quick, send me 1,000 words." And this is the result. Champion of the press, whole page. And I went to the memorial, gave the eulogy, distributed copies, and he was a man at 95. Everybody he knew had died, and now his family knew that one time he had been a hero on the other side of the world. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Now we've got, we've got 5 minutes. I think we can probably extend that a bit, but questions, please.
Thank you. That was a really interesting rendition. I'm third generation Asian. So my grandfather was born in. My grandfather came to Asia in 1900. My father was born in Tianjin and grew up in Qingdao. There's a whole story behind that. So your story was fascinating. I just have one quick question. What is a taxi dancer?
What is it, what?
What is a taxi dancer?
A taxi dancer. Oh, a taxi dancer, okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the nightclubs, customers would go in and they'd buy a book of tickets. And when, you gave the girl a ticket for a dance. And she was like a taxi. She just went wherever client wanted her. Okay? Well, now you do.
Questions, comments? Oh, well, I'm going to ask them, Nicholas. Look, there's a huge amount of material in this book. Are you going to follow it up with more specifics on particular aspects of it, or whether it's the family, the politics, the well, there's so many aspects.
It's a very busy book. I am planning one book is already finished in first form and another book, but not about my mother or China. I used to wake up in the middle of the night, terrified, thinking I'll never finish this book on my mother. And a friend of mine said, "Just send me a couple of chapters and I'll lay it out in book form." And I said, no, I'm not going to let go of this book until every word is finished. That was probably the most stupid thing I ever said. But anyway, he sent me the thing, and when I saw the book form, I was galvanized. And I worked for 60 days, day and night, 2 chapters a week, boom, and then it was finished.
Right, one more question.
Thanks very much. That was really terrific. You obviously were very close to your mom and knew a lot about her, but was there anything when you started doing your research that you found out about her or elements of her life that surprised you?
Something I found out about
About your mother when you were doing the research.
that was a
Anything
surprise.
surprised you, yeah?
Well, I found out about her father and the Russian mistress, and I found out why Paddy, her first husband, abandoned her. And later on, when she was working for the UN in Bangkok, she fell in love with an English professor, a Scottish professor, and that was the love of her life. For 5 years, they lived in bliss in London. Until they didn't. And then she discovered that he was leading a double life. He had a family elsewhere. And so I did a lot of research into him. And she wondered, for the rest of her life, did Jimmy really love me? Or was it all, tortured for the rest of her life? I wish that she was alive, I could tell her. Because in the book I discovered a court case wherein his true propensity was revealed. So I did discover things.
If I may add personally that having read the book, there's a lot more than that. Right, one final question here.
Well, Ian, I think this is the second time you've talked about this book at the FCC. The first time it was when it was in progress, but by now it's become so much richer, and your storytelling was wonderful. But my question is, how did your mother, did she ever express herself? Number one, did she ever consider writing her own memoir? Number two, did she ever express herself about these men who had loved her and left her? And was she bitter? Or was her personality such that she just moved on?
Now, the first question was, well, I'll take the second question first, because I can remember that one. She was very disappointed in her relationships with men. As I said, she couldn't understand why Paddy had loved her and then left her. But and then George, although she knew the story, she knew that he was married. I mean, she still hoped that he would stay with her, but she also knew he had a decision to make. She felt bad. We went to England for a year, and they still exchanged letters. And he said, my wife and I have made up, and we're very happy. And she was a bit bitter about that because it felt like she was the knife was being twisted, and she was having a terrible time in England in 1946. If you were a single mother in England, forget it. Nobody would hire you. There were newspaper stories about single mothers leaving their babies in telephone booths. I mean, it was just a terrible life. She couldn't get a job. She was cooped up in this tiny, anyway. So she felt, she didn't feel good when George said, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? But she did recover. She did have, she suffered deeply, but she did have a resilience. And she always came out of it well. And she always told me, whenever I had a problem, it was a friend who helped me out. Because she did have this wonderful empathy. She was able to connect with people. And that, helped her when she was in trouble.
The first question was, did she ever consider writing a memoir?
She gave tape recordings. Of course, I interviewed her eternally. She wrote, she had her letters. Her correspondence with Emily Hahn was very, very revealing. No, she wanted me to write it. I took too long, but there we go.
Right, well, Ian, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful talk about a wonderful book. And so if you haven't bought it already, please go ahead. Meanwhile, we have the usual gift for our speakers.
Oops.
Ian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Well, thank you very much, sir. Philip, yeah.